drones and shadows. Corporal Cade froze. His suit detected the hum of drone engines before his ears did and alerted him to the danger. He already had a preset infrared profile prepared to deal with this recurring problem. In a few seconds he would appear as no more than an errant garbage can to IR sensors. "You are trash," he repeated to himself like a mantra, holding still with all his willpower as the enemy drone swarm flew overhead. He would blend in perfectly with his surroundings. This city was a giant open-air landfill anyway. After a few moments, and with reasonable confidence they hadn't noticed him, he continued on through the ruins. This section of the city had been hit hard by the recent fighting. His own side's drones hadn't been able to make it this far in due to some unusually heavy jamming. He would occasionally encounter one with its emergency light winking red in the smoke and haze of the battlefield. Taking a moment to survey the situation, he looked into the distance. The spine loomed, though many miles away. Its fractured bulk was the perfect backdrop to the current situation. Big, expensive, and hopelessly broken. Years ago it had been called the Spire, the largest megastructure ever conceived by humanity, an orbital elevator meant to usher in the next phase of human expansion into space. But just before it was completed, an asteroid or some other space debris had hit near the top of the spire. It had stripped away the cladding to reveal the magnetic rails and ribbed internal structure, tall and bone white. Cade sighed to himself and hefted his pulse rifle, scanning the rest of the horizon, trying to get his bearings after his last dash to the relative safety of yet another abandoned building. He had to get to that drone control center. His mission was to destroy it. Even orbital scans hadn't been able to reveal its location. There were too many ways for drones to hide, and the jamming was interfering with all of their sensors and recon drones. Luckily, or maybe not, the heavy exosuit had enough shielding, at least at the moment, to withstand the majority of the problems. But his comms were nothing but static, and the isolation was definitely starting to get to him. It had been 2 days since the bad drop. They'd gotten ambushed, mostly human combatants, but they were hit mid-flight and were well within the blackout zone, unable to get any call for help. He had a job to do, not just for the sake of his fallen squad, but because he wouldn't survive to be exfiltrated without clearing the jamming field. A gust of wind blew through the dusty carcasses of the surrounding buildings, causing them to emit an almost melodious whistling sound. It made him shiver. Even in his isolated state, he'd have preferred the complete silence or the hum of drone copters to that. He rounded a corner and knelt to check his map. Still on track for the approximate location. The drones were patrolling a general center point, which had already been hit several times with hypersonic missiles, but to no avail. Most of the drones also had primitive microwave shielding foil tape over the electronics. Many of the frames were even constructed from wood to save money and weight. This had made them very difficult to destroy in mass, and there just weren't enough resources to throw at the problem these days without deploying a massive amount of material to fight the drones one-on-one. It was actually more cost-effective to send humans to do it. Lucky him. Ducking into an empty storefront, he decided to record his progress so far. It felt a lot like sending a message in a bottle at this point, unsure as he was that anyone would ever find his combat log. He took a sip of his dwindling water and continued on. It had started to get near dusk, the haze of dust blending into a haze of shade and shadows. He came to an abandoned intersection. Eerily quiet, he hesitated. It was a lot of open space to clear. 4 lanes stretched ahead without anything, not even an abandoned car. Not wanting to spend too much time, he sprinted across the distance, his power armor's legs propelling him in a fraction of the time it would take without them. Too bad his power was running low. He would have loved to rush in, guns blazing, and right back out again. He cleared the distance and jumped over a broken barricade, then hunkered down. At the far end of the other street was a formation of drones headed in the other direction. He hoped they hadn't detected him. But one of the drones in the rear of the formation malfunctioned, wavering drunkenly from side to side as it tried to remain in sync with the others. At last, with a final spark and flutter, it spun out of the sky some 40 feet away and came to rest too near Cade. Its camera must have crossed over him in its descent. He waited in silence for only a split second before leaping back over the barrier. He'd been seen. No sooner had he cleared the top of the barricade than he heard shots ring out from the drone formation. Some of the drones weren't the typical self-detonating type and had been equipped with small arms. He used the telescoping stalk on his shoulder-mounted microwave emitter to send a pulse over the barricade. Most of the drones had that silver tape on them, but a few might go down. His armor detected the sound of the remaining drones as they positioned themselves for the attack. They had decent coordination software and would attempt to maneuver into optimal positions before rushing him in a final explosive collision. He wouldn't give them the time, especially since they hadn't been programmed to account for his suit's enhanced capabilities. Even if they had, he could almost move as fast as them, albeit only in short bursts. Rounding the edge of the barricade, he saw the first one. He fired off a short burst, and it flared into a fireball. Incendiary charge. That wasn't very nice of them, but inexpensive and potentially deadly. Small arms fire pinged off his rear armor as one of the long-range drones cleared the concrete shield. Pivoting fluidly, he fired another burst, and the drone shattered into wood and metal fragments. Running in the direction of the downed unit, he left the cover of the barricade and ran to the nearest building. There was an explosion behind him as several of the remaining drones destroyed his former refuge, the heat and pressure knocking him off his feet and into a tumble. Rolling with the explosion, he got to his feet and leapt the 12 feet or so into a second-story window. Most of the glass had already been shattered, so he glided in through the opening and rolled to a stop, lying down and facing the fresh entrance, his rifle ready. A drone flared, spraying what smelled like burning gasoline all over the interior of the room. The space felt like it was intended to be an open floor-plan office building, but it was never occupied, stacks of unused cubicle walls shielding him from most of the splashes. He backed out the door into a long, empty hallway, weapon at the ready. Continuing to cover for another possible attack, he glanced around briefly. There were a number of doors to the interior side of the building, so he tried the first one. It was locked. Putting some power into it, he rammed the door with his shoulder, and it burst off its hinges and clattered to the ground. Too much force. And too much noise. He took a moment to catch his breath and check his map. This was within the probable radius of the control center. These drones only lasted for a few hours before needing to recharge and rearm. If he could find that control center and take it out, all he would need to do was wait for the swarm's batteries to run out, and he could be extracted. Another strike wasn't authorized. The Orbital Launch Authority, or OLA, had already considered this mission too costly as it was, and they didn't want any more collateral damage. An irony lost on no one, given the current state of the entire Spire project. He knew he couldn't stay here long. The smell of smoke was getting stronger, and with the mess he had made just a few minutes earlier, he knew there would be other swarms on the way, if not actual human combatants. A power armor trooper was formidable on their own, but he was alone after all and would tire eventually. The jamming meant that the drones couldn't transmit any data, but if the patrol didn't return, they would send additional resources to investigate, and he didn't want to be here when that happened. Returning to the long hallway, he carefully poked his head into every exterior-facing room until he found one with unshattered glass by the street farthest from where the last fight had occurred. Entering the room, he looked out onto the street below. Something must have happened here several years ago. There were a couple of abandoned OLA patrol MRAPs burned out. Unfortunate for them, but cover for him. He descended a staircase to the bottom floor and found a street exit near the MRAPs. Scanning the sky, he ran for the first vehicle. He had just made it into the door when another drone patrol came around the building's corner. He lay down as best he could in his somewhat bulky armor and engaged his active IR camouflage again. The drones progressed down the street slowly, being thorough in their search patterns. They'd arrived quickly, It had only been 10 minutes or so since he'd destroyed the other cluster. That could be an indication that he was close to the control center. He wasn't sure if that was true, but hoped for the best anyway. The sensor sweeps of the enemy were displayed on his helmet's HUD, shifting lazily down the street, occasionally stopping at an object of interest for closer inspection. He tensed and lowered his head, readying his weapons for a possible attack. A 3-unit group hovered over his MRAP for a moment, then he watched as they separated to check the abandoned vehicles. With careful precision, one of the drones came down from above the roof of the vehicle and slipped inside the armored frame. He lay on his back in the rear of the unit, under a bank of folding chairs for soldiers. It had largely been stripped of anything of value, only a few scraps of padding remained on the chairs, and the plastic and metal frames were bent. Again, he tried to visualize himself as garbage. If the drone had a LiDAR sensor, it would easily detect his humanoid contours and attack. His armor was tough, but had seen a lot of action already and couldn't take a direct hit from a medium-sized charge at this range. He held his breath as the sensor swept over his prone form. He heard the rush of air flowing from the drone's fans. He could almost feel it moving his hair, although he knew that was impossible with his fully sealed helmet. He caught brief flashes as it hovered above him, illuminated by the flickering streetlights. He heard the same melodic whistling sound that had haunted him on and off all day. In time, the drone floated out of the door and rejoined its larger formation. Cautiously, he sat up and watched as the enemy rounded the corner and went down another roadway. He shouldered his rifle as he exited the vehicle and decided to head in the direction the drones had come from. That would be the most likely origin of the drone control center. There was a very large apartment complex in that direction that was known to be occupied by squatters. It wasn't the epicenter of the drone patrols, and since it was known to be inhabited by civilians, it hadn't been struck by any missiles. It's not that the OLA was especially queasy about the human costs of war, but there was only so much bad publicity they were willing to take with the project, in as bad a shape as it was already. Swiftly and quietly he proceeded to his destination. There would need to be a large power source to operate overlapping drone patrols and to run multiple jamming nodes that covered an area this large. It was likely that the inhabitants of the area had pulled miles of electrical cables and run them underground to power the whole setup, with multiple subterranean entrances so the drones couldn't be tracked to a single location. He inspected the light posts. This one was not functioning. Its maintenance panel was opened, and the interior was hollow. Hardly surprising, though. But there was at least some power to this area, even if it was intermittent. There were solar arrays on almost every rooftop, but they would need extensive batteries to operate overnight. It would have been nice if they could have just cut the power to this section of the city and waited them out. Continuing on, he came to an underground parking entrance at the base of the apartment complex. It sloped off the main road, out of the flickering light and into steady darkness. As carefully as he could, he approached the tiny hut that in a functioning city should have been occupied by an automaton staff member. It was filled only with dirty blankets and cardboard. Someone's home. Well, it was cozy at least, but it appeared to be abandoned, likely due to the recent violence. He stepped carefully around the broken gate and into the parking garage. Car recharging stations were pulled and gutted, leaving holes in the concrete where they were meant to be. They had been very efficiently removed and recycled, no doubt. Many of the components were likely used to build the drones and their supporting infrastructure. Across the parking lot were the stairs that led up into the main part of the building. As he continued on, he heard the familiar whistling sound again. He froze. How was that possible? He was inside the building now, and it sounded so close. Carefully peering around a corner, he saw dark shapes hunched over an enemy drone. There was a faint glow illuminating them from behind. At first, he thought it was a group of rebels doing drone repairs, but the silhouettes were all wrong. Their heads had very sharp, elongated points, and an array of what looked like cameras. Were these humanoid drones? They seemed far too costly to be doing simple drone repairs in a place like this. The whistling began again. Slightly discordant and lilting, the sound gradually synchronized and intensified. Just as it was beginning to crest, it abruptly stopped, and so did the figures. What he supposed were their heads turned and looked directly at him. They weren't drones, couldn't be. With lightning-swift motion, they stood and charged him. He let out a full burst from his pulse rifle, the flashes revealing a blaze of images as they approached. They must have had weapons of some kind because he felt something impact his leg, and it almost took him down. Bullets or something sliced the air over his head. He fired a grenade from his rifle at the feet of the nearest one and ducked back around a corner. It detonated, and he was glad for the automatic hearing protection in his helmet. He reloaded and went back around the corner, determined to press the attack. It looked like the grenade did the trick, however, as there was no motion on any of his detectors. Stooping down, he inspected the nearest creature. It was vaguely insectoid. It had a large, pointed, triangular head with numerous black orbs studded along the corners. Its body was also triangular with an arm-like appendage on each side and 3 legs as well. It appeared to have been carrying a weapon of some kind similar to a rifle. That reminded him he had been hit in the leg, so he looked down to inspect the damage. Several black spikes were stuck in his right shin guard. A large, prominent one had pierced his armor, but at an angle, so it hadn't gone through his leg. That would have definitely complicated the mission. Movement caught his attention. The creature was shot to bits, but it slowly stirred. It lay in a pool of thick white liquid very similar in appearance to school glue and faintly luminous. Chunks of its black shell were mixed among the fluids. How could this thing still be moving, even slightly? It was far too damaged to be any threat, but it seemed to refuse to die. The broken edges of its armored exterior frayed and appeared fibrous. Some of the outermost edges were smoldering, red embers almost ready to light into a fire. Some of the larger threads were burning lightly, tracing along the line of the fiber, traveling in a wavy, swirling pattern that was almost beautiful. It was difficult to believe what he was seeing, but he backed away after he was sure that he had captured enough footage for analysis. Going over to the drone, passing other downed creatures, he examined what they had been doing. They hadn't been repairing the drone, but disassembling it, and they were very particular about it. It didn't look like they needed any tools, and every tiny screw had been removed from half of the unit. Each one was laid out on the concrete in a perfect grid-like pattern, along with the other parts. The silver foil tape had been removed and meticulously folded over on itself and set aside. I hope they don't treat people the same way, he thought to himself. But he already felt like that hope was in vain. How many of them were there? He'd been hearing that whistling noise for some time, but hadn't seen one until now. He'd been alone for several days, cut off from everyone, with no communication. Was the unease he had felt more than just his isolation? A growing sense of dread came over him. He was surrounded, and he didn't even know by what or how many. Were they responsible for the jamming? It would have taken an incredible amount of power to generate a field this dense. Did they generate it themselves, or was there some technological device they were employing? So many questions and no way to answer them as a single man alone in a vast ruined city. He gathered his wits and returned to the stairway, needing to continue his search for the drone control center. Although the exterior of the building looked to be in good repair, the interior had seen better days. A large section of stairs had given way, and he had to jump, chunks of concrete breaking loose from the edge to crash loudly below. He didn't know what kind of hearing those things had, but if they could, they'd notice that for sure, if the grenade hadn't already alerted them to his presence. Above his head was a rather large hole in the ceiling that led all the way to what looked like the top floor. Cables had ran along the edge of the garage, up the wall and through the hole. This should lead to the control center then. There were signs of habitation, but no people, no whistlers, as he'd taken to calling them, and no drone control center. Plus, all of the rooms and hallways had started looking the same a long time ago. Just as he was about to take a short break to recharge, He opened one last door on the 12th floor and almost gagged. This is what had happened to all of the people. The Whistlers had given the same treatment to the building's residents. Dissection, but in the most precise and meticulous way possible. This large apartment now hosted several hundred people's remains. Not that he stayed to count them all. Bones were neatly stacked by type, organs as well. Every pot and pan held blood. For such a grisly task, the apartment was surprisingly clean. Not clean enough to get their security deposit back, but still. With significant effort, he closed the door and decided to continue to the next floor, eager to put that sight behind him. He decided to start with the maintenance section. Near the top of the building, there should be a mechanical room of some kind. Off the main stairway that led to the roof was a door marked for maintenance staff only. It barely hung on its hinges. What looked like claw marks had scratched the doorknob away. A hole had been cut in the bottom of the door, and a large bundle of electrical cables went in. If there was a drone control center in the building, it had to be here. And if there were any more Whistlers, as he suspected there must be, they would be here as well. Despite the hum from the completely unsafe power cables, none of the lights were on. In fact, all of the light bars had been destroyed. The hum of the power cables intensified as more cables came up through holes in the floor. They must have run the additional cables up the air vents, and there was a huge hole through the center of the building all the way to the parking garage. Some of the cables ran upward, and he assumed they went to the roof to power some other device up there. He turned a corner and stepped into a pool of some sort of commercial chemical. Around a large drum that must have been 100 gallons was a dozen or more of the creatures. They used their pointy fingers to puncture the side of the plastic barrel and were lapping up the bright blue fluid. They were whistling up a storm. He was glad they were more excited about drinking industrial chemicals than what came in people, even though he knew that wouldn't save him. They hadn't seemed to notice him, engrossed as they were with getting drunk off whatever it was they had found. He chambered his last grenade, took aim at the center of the flock of creatures, and pulled the trigger. The offensive grenade blew the center Whistler almost in half and scattered the rest. Most of them didn't seem to have their weapons on them, and so he opened fire on the rest. The rounds cracked through their shells easily enough, but the creatures wouldn't go down. He reloaded and started backing up, hosing them down with fire the whole time. Not a single other monster fell after that first one. And now they were starting to regain their heads, coming towards him in a rush. He fired again, slowing but not crippling any of them. How many bullets would it take? Whenever it took a serious amount of damage, they would just swivel their heads and bodies around to a new fresh section and continue on. They must not have their brains in their heads, because he put about 20 rounds in one, but it just turned its head to present the most functional eyes and kept coming. He was backing up the stairs to the roof now. Shouldering the door open, he went out. There were a number of large commercial AC units and other equipment he didn't recognize. There was something that looked like a control antenna with cables from the floor below running to it. The jamming from the bugs made it useless, but it was for sure the control array. The drones had been running on their last orders, unable to receive new ones. One of the creatures poked its long, pointed face around the door behind him. He gave it a few rounds, but it didn't even duck its head back. If only he had a way to take out the top couple of floors of this building. He'd have to hit the drone equipment and all of the Whistlers at once. There was a sound behind him. More Whistlers had been on the roof and were now advancing toward him from several directions. He was surrounded and almost out of ammunition. There was really only one idea he had left. He went into his IR system and turned it to maximum, then ran to the nearest edge of the building that was free of enemies. He started flailing his arms and yelling. Several large drone swarms were immediately on alert, their motors winding up to attack him. The Whistler seemed confused as he rushed back into their midst, emptying his last magazine and pulling out his combat knife. He buried it in the triangular head of one of the creatures and punched another, its head exploding with a satisfying squelch. One of them managed to grab his ankle and pull him to the ground, but it was already too late for them. Drones were pouring over the lip of the building and crashing into the whistlers in their attempt to get to him. Pops and explosions, incendiaries, and small-caliber rounds rained down on them. As one final act, he switched his heat profile to garbage and was still struggling as the crackling explosions came closer. There must have been hundreds of them. Part of the roof gave way. He fell into darkness. The labyrinth below. The drop ship shuddered as it cut through the murky atmosphere above the ruins, its engines a low, steady hum beneath the sporadic crackle of static in their comms. Outside the reinforced viewport was the sprawl of the city, punctuated by the peak of the orbital elevator, its sleek silhouette slicing through the haze. Below it the city stretched out in ruins, a graveyard of steel and concrete swallowed by time and neglect. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. The three occupants, strapped into their seats, barely spoke above the hum of the engines. The faint vibration of turbulence was the only constant, a rhythmic reminder of the precarious mission ahead. Mac's house had been a waste of time. His samples were ruined, burned out, useless. All the team learned was how bad the aliens smelled after they'd been electrocuted. Cade leaned forward, his boots planted firmly on the grated floor, and glanced at Dr. Martell. His voice cut through the cabin like a blade, sharp and deliberate. These bugs aren't just another species of pest. They're lethal, and we're not here to play scientists. Martell, seated across from him, didn't flinch. She adjusted her datapad, her gloved fingers scrolling through notes with a practiced precision. Her voice, calm but resolute, countered Cade's bluntness. We've seen what their bioelectricity can do. The samples, even degraded, were enough to show that. If we can capture a fresh specimen intact, I might be able to figure out how they're weaponizing their internal power supply. We need to understand their biology to counter it effectively. She shifted in her seat, trying to get comfortable. Ergonomics were never a top priority in the military, and they absolutely didn't have her in mind when designing anything. She fidgeted with the straps on the armor they made her wear. They just wouldn't go tight enough. Maybe they were just messing with her and gave her ill-fitting equipment as a joke. But glancing at the faces of the two soldiers, she knew how seriously they were taking this mission and dismissed the idea. Jansen snorted from his seat beside Cade, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His pale face was lined with tension, his eyes distant as if caught in some memory. Understanding doesn't matter if they rip you apart first, he muttered, his tone bitter. They don't care about understanding what they do to us. They just take us apart piece by piece, and it looks like they always start at the legs. It takes a long time to die that way. Rick didn't deserve that. His fingers twitched as he spoke, his anger barely contained. Rick had been a childhood friend of his and was on that first mission when the bugs were encountered. The gun looked like a knife in a little kid's hand. They had all been separated, but Rick had been severely injured and the whistlers got to him. There were signs of a battle, but ultimately they had dragged him into one of the surrounding buildings. His armor and weapons were found on one of the floors near the top of the apartment complex, completely disassembled, and so was he. His bones were meticulously cleaned and stacked near those of the former building's tenants, next to his things. Martell didn't look up. And if we don't understand them, how do you suggest we stop them? Bullets don't always work, as you've seen. Electricity does. Why? She met Jansen's gaze then, her calm demeanor cutting through his hostility. Because their internal systems rely on bioelectricity and they lose control when it's disrupted. We might be able to exploit that, but only if we know how. Speculation won't keep us alive, Cade said, his voice low but firm. You saw the burns on the ones Mac electrocuted. They don't just die, they burn out completely. That's all I need to know. We hit them hard, no hesitation. Martell sighed, leaning back against the cold metal seat. And when we run out of ways to hit them hard, what then? I see you didn't bring a giant battery to shock them with. Just more bullets? The static in the comms spiked, filling the cabin with a burst of white noise before settling again. Jansen stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. Cade checked his weapon, his movements mechanical, while Martel returned to her notes. The silence stretched, heavier now, a dense fog of unresolved tension. The pilot's voice crackled through their earpieces, breaking the moment. 1 minute to drop. Gear up. Cade stood, securing his rifle with a sharp click. We do this my way, he said, his tone brooking no argument. His gaze lingered on Martel. Don't let your curiosity get us killed. The dropship began its descent, the vibrations intensifying. Martel's grip tightened on her data pad, her knuckles pale. Jansen closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly, before unbuckling his harness and rising. Outside, the ruined city waited, its dark secrets buried in the labyrinth below. The hum of the engines faded, replaced by the sound of their boots on the grated ramp. The mission had begun. The tunnel yawned before them, a jagged mouth leading into the dark depths of the city's underground. Following Mac's map, Cade led the way, his rifle raised and scanning the shadows. The air shifted as they descended, cooler, heavier, and carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. Their flashlights cut narrow paths through the gloom, revealing slick walls lined with exposed cables and rusting conduits. Each step sent echoes cascading down the tunnel, doubling back like whispers from the dark. The sound was unnerving, amplifying the already suffocating silence. Stay sharp, Cade murmured, his voice low. He glanced at Martel, who trailed behind him with her head down, focused on the ground. Martel, keep close. She didn't answer immediately, crouching to examine a faint smear of glowing liquid on the wall. The bioluminescent streak pulsed faintly in the dim light, as though clinging to life. She held out a vial, carefully scraping the residue into it with the tip of a gloved finger. The sample shimmered faintly, glowing blue against the dark. It's still active, she said, her voice soft with awe, even after exposure to the air. These creatures, their bioelectricity is unlike anything we've encountered. Jansen, his rifle sweeping back and forth in a slow arc, didn't hide his unease. You've got your sample, Doc, he muttered. Now let's keep moving. We don't want to stay down here too long. Martel straightened, carefully capping the vial and tucking it into her pack. We need to collect more. If their systems are this robust even in death... She trailed off, her flashlight catching another smear on the floor ahead. Nearby, a jagged fragment of chitin glinted faintly, one edge blackened and burned. She knelt again, brushing dust away to expose it further. She wondered how they'd gotten injured. Mac had said he hadn't fought any of them until he got back to his house. Doc, Cade interrupted sharply. Analyze later. Move now. She nodded, falling back into line behind him. As they pressed deeper, the tunnel began to change. Piles of dismantled drones and stripped-down machines littered the sides, their components meticulously removed. Cables dangled from the ceiling, severed cleanly as if by an unseen surgeon. Cade gestured to one, his expression grim. You're too clean, he said. Deliberate. They're not just tearing things apart. They're targeting specific systems, infrastructure. They don't seem interested in non-electrical systems like plumbing or anything. Precision work, Martel added, her brow furrowed. It's not random destruction. They're learning, or trying to learn anyway. Jansen swore under his breath. Learning for what? To turn it all back on us? Martel didn't answer. She was staring at a severed bundle of wires, her flashlight illuminating their sharp, smooth edges. This is recent, she said quietly. Look at the burn marks. Still fresh. They were just here. One of them might have gotten injured while cutting these cables. It must have been the one whose blood she'd collected. As if to punctuate her words, the comms crackled with static, a sharp burst that made Jansen wince. He tapped his earpiece, frowning. Comms are glitching. Anyone else getting this? Not unexpected, Cade muttered, adjusting the settings on his helmet. The static persisted, growing louder with each step. They're jamming us. Deliberate interference. Martel nodded absently, her eyes scanning the walls. Their bioelectricity could be emitting a signal, she said. It's sophisticated enough to disrupt electronics. It makes sense they'd use it to keep us in the dark. Great, Jansen muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. So, we're walking blind into their nest. Cade shot him a sharp look, eyes up, focus. They know we're here, but we're not turning back. We brought enough hardware to handle a group twice the size as last time. We don't know if they make nests, do we? Martel questioned aloud. No one has ever seen where they live, right? We're making the assumption that since they appear vaguely like insects, that they behave like insects. We have already seen that they don't. Cade nodded. That was true, actually. Nothing looking like a nest was found anywhere in the above-ground sections that had been investigated. The static hummed in their ears now, a low, insistent vibration that seemed to seep into their bones. Ahead, the tunnel stretched endlessly, the shadows shifting just out of reach of their lights. The air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Kay gestured forward. We keep moving, no stopping unless absolutely necessary. His voice was steady, but his jaw tightened as the static crackled louder. They're watching us. Let's not give them a reason to get closer. The team moved deeper into the dark, their breaths shallow, each step drawing them farther into the labyrinth where the bugs waited. The junction room was an ominous expanse of derelict machinery and scattered debris. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang that seemed to cling to the back of their throats. Cade advanced cautiously, rifle raised, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Every step echoed unnervingly, the sound swallowed by the cavernous space. Looks clear, Cade muttered, his voice a low rumble. Stay tight. Martel crouched near a twisted heap of machinery, her gloved fingers brushing over a severed cable. Another clean cut, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Same precision as before. Great, means we're close, Jansen said, scanning the room's far corners with quick, anxious sweeps of his flashlight. His voice was tight, his tension palpable. Or they are. Then it came, a faint, high-pitched whistle. It started soft, almost delicate, drifting through the air like a forgotten melody. Cade signaled the team to hold, then froze. The sound grew louder, its cadence rhythmic and unnervingly alien, resonating through the tunnels. Jansen hissed, gripping his weapon tighter. Cade stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, his rifle aimed toward the source of the sound. The whistle stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against their ears. A sudden screech of metal from above shattered the stillness. "Contact!" Cade barked, his rifle snapping upward. From the shadows, a glossy black figure emerged, its beetle-like shell reflecting the flickering light. Its triangular head tilted, and its three limbs moved with eerie fluidity as it crawled along the ceiling. In one quick motion, it dropped to the ground, its scalpel-like fingers glinting. Cade fired immediately, the sharp crack of his rifle echoing through the room. Bullets sparked against the bug's shell, some glancing off, others biting into its limbs. The creature twisted, its body rotating with unnatural precision, presenting undamaged limbs as it lunged forward. Cade growled, stepping back as the creature's claw swiped inches from his torso. "Go for the legs!" Jansen fired alongside him, his shots more frantic, his breaths loud and ragged. The bug moved like liquid, dodging between volleys, its whistle rising again in a chilling, discordant note. Martel pressed herself against a wall, her flashlight clattering to the floor as she struggled to keep hold of her samples. Her voice was sharp, laced with urgency as she picked up her flashlight again. "It's movements! It's adapting! Aim for the joints!" Before they could adjust, another whistle echoed from the far tunnel, then another and another. The team turned as more bugs emerged, their glossy shells glinting as they crawled along walls and the ceiling, their movements unnervingly coordinated. "They're surrounding us," Jansen yelled, his voice breaking as he fired blindly at the nearest bug. The comms crackled with static, sharp bursts that drowned out any hope of communication. Cade tapped his helmet, his jaw tight. They're jamming us. Still no comms. The bugs closed in, their scalpel fingers slicing through debris and wiring with terrifying precision. Back to the dropship, Cade ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. Now! The team fell into a retreat, their boots pounding against the floor. Martell clutched her flashlight tightly as she followed close behind, her breaths shallow and rapid. The dropship came into view as they stumbled out of the tunnel, its floodlights casting long shadows against the rubble-strewn clearing. But the relief was short-lived. One of the bugs clung to the ship's hull above, its limbs moving with methodical purpose. It drove its scalpel-like fingers into a panel, sparks flying as it severed critical wiring. "Get it off!" Jansen yelled just as another bug darted across the ground, releasing a burst of electrical discharge into the ship's exposed power grid. The explosion was instantaneous. A deafening roar tore through the air, a blinding flash of light swallowing the ship as the blast wave hurled the team back into the rubble. Martell hit the ground hard, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. Cade pushed himself up, coughing against the dust and smoke. The drop ship was a smoldering wreck, its once imposing frame now a heap of twisted metal. He swore, slamming a fist into the ground. "We're stranded!" The whistle returned, faint but growing, a cruel reminder of the enemies still stalking them. Martell staggered to her feet, clutching a sample case against her chest. "We can't leave this," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "We need these remains." "Yeah," Cade said with resignation, dragging Jansen to his feet. "But we need to move. They know exactly where we are, and there's too much visibility here. We need to go underground again, where we have a chance at fighting bugs one at a time." Overhead, the dropship's escort drones moved on to mark the secondary extraction site. "Hopefully it won't take HQ too long to figure out what happened and to send backup," Jansen said. Whistles could be heard in the distance, answers to the call being picked up and repeated from other directions. The team turned back toward the tunnels, their shadows stretching long as the wreckage burned. The whistling rose again, chilling and relentless, pursuing them into the dark. The team turned a corner and froze. Before them, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, its walls lined with broken machinery and scattered drones. At first glance, it looked like the aftermath of some forgotten battle, but as Cade's flashlight swept over the scene, the truth became clear. There were so many bugs here. Far too many. Glossy black shapes moved with unnerving precision, their scalpel-like fingers dissecting drone carcasses and sorting the components into neat piles. One of the creatures crouched over a torn-open control panel, its limbs rotating seamlessly as it extracted wires and circuits with delicate care. "They're dismantling everything," Martell whispered, her voice laced with awe and dread. "This isn't just survival. They're engineers, repurposing human tech for something." "They're scavengers," Jansen spat, his rifle trained on the nearest bug. "Just like Max said, only difference is they don't trade for scraps, they kill for it." Martell took a cautious step forward, her datapad raised. "We need to study this, their behavior, their methods." Jansen rounded on her, his face twisted in anger. "Study," he hissed. "You want to stop and take notes while they're ripping us apart? They dissected my friend, Martell. You think they won't do the same to you?" Cade cut in sharply. "Enough," he whispered. "Both of you, we don't have time for this." He glanced at Martell. "Take your notes if you have to, but do it fast." The tension crackled like the static in their comms, but Martell obeyed, capturing quick images and logging observations. Jansen paced behind her, his grip on his rifle white-knuckled. The whistling returned, louder this time and closer. The bugs in the nest froze, their triangular heads tilting in eerie unison toward the team. "They know we're here," Cade said, raising his rifle. "Martell, now!" The first bug lunged, its scalpel fingers glinting in the flashlight beams. Cade fired, the crack of his rifle echoing violently in the confined space. The bug twisted midair, its trifold body rotating to shield its vulnerable joints. Jansen opened fire as more bugs swarmed from the shadows, their movements fluid and coordinated. One reached him before he could adjust his aim, its scalpel fingers slicing between the armored plates at his elbow with surgical precision. He screamed, falling back against the wall, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Jansen!" Martel dropped to his side, pulling a tourniquet from her pack. Her hands moved quickly despite the tremble in them, tightening the strap around his bleeding arm. Cade shot the legs out from under the bug that had wounded Jansen, then emptied another magazine into the swarm. But the bugs kept coming, their sheer numbers overwhelming. "Martel, any ideas?" he shouted, backing toward them. Martel's gaze darted to a shattered bug carcass nearby, its glowing biofluids pooling on the floor. She reached for her pack, pulling out a handful of conductive wires. "This machinery is still partially active. Those capacitors are charged and connected to a solar array at the surface. We can bypass the safeties, and that should make it arc out into the room. Their blood should help carry the current, but we don't want to be near when that happens." "Do it," Cade growled, stepping to guard her and firing in controlled bursts. His bullets slowed the swarm, but the creatures adapted quickly, rotating their limbs to protect themselves. Martel worked frantically, connecting the wires to a capacitor and plunging a cable into the glowing pool. Sparks flew as the makeshift trap charged. "Done!" she yelled, retreating to safety with Jansen in tow. Cade lured the bugs closer, then dove aside as Martel triggered the trap. The machine panels exploded outward in a violent arc of electricity, catching the swarm mid-attack. The bugs convulsed, their bioluminescent blood flaring brilliantly as their systems overloaded. The smell of burning chitin filled the air as they collapsed. The remaining bugs hesitated, their whistles shifting into an unnerving harmony. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they retreated into the shadows. "That worked," Jansen said, panting. "Almost too late for us," Cade said, his voice grim. He hauled Jansen to his feet, ignoring the younger man's muffled groans. "We're not out of this yet. Move." The tunnels ahead loomed darker, the faint hum of static growing louder as they pressed on. The maintenance chamber loomed before them, a vast expanse of rusting machinery and half-collapsed scaffolding bathed in the flickering glow of emergency lights. In the center, an ancient elevator stood silent, its battered cage the only promise of escape to the surface. The air was thick with the metallic tang of decay and the oppressive weight of the tunnels closing in behind them. Cade stormed into the chamber, rifle raised, his eyes scanning every shadow. "This is it," he barked. "Martel, can you see if you can get that elevator running? Jansen, with me, defensive positions now." Martel nodded, already sprinting toward the control console at the base of the elevator. Her boots kicked up dust as she knelt and began yanking open access panels, her hands trembling but precise as she examined the jumble of wires. Jansen followed Cade, his injured arm clutched to his side, his rifle in his good hand. The faint haunting whistle that had followed them through the tunnels grew louder, echoing from every direction. It was no longer a distant melody, it was a rising chorus, relentless and suffocating. "They're coming," Jansen said through gritted teeth, his voice taut with pain and determination. He set his rifle against a crate for stability, his sharp eyes scanning the tunnels leading into the chamber. "They've got nowhere else to go but through us," Cade growled, planting himself at the center of the room. "And I've had enough of these things." The whistling reached a crescendo as the first bugs emerged, their glossy, beetle-like shells coming into view. They swarmed from multiple tunnels, their triangular heads tilting in unison as they assessed the team. "Fire!" Cade roared, unleashing a burst of gunfire. Bullets sparked against the bugs' chitinous exteriors, but the swarm pressed forward, their scalpel-like fingers slashing through debris as they moved in. Jansen joined in, his rifle barking in rhythmic bursts. The bugs rotated their limbs seamlessly, shielding themselves as they closed the distance. One darted toward him, its claws raised. With a feral snarl, he kicked a nearby crate into its path, throwing it off balance long enough to land a series of shots to its limbs, disabling it. The creature collapsed in a sparking heap, its bioluminescent blood casting an eerie glow on the floor. He kicked the remainder away, knowing his shots wouldn't be enough to kill it outright. "Martel, we need that elevator yesterday," Cade yelled over the chaos. "I'm working on it," she snapped, sweat dripping down her face as she fought to reroute power to the elevator controls. Her fingers danced over the wires, connecting a frayed bundle to a portable generator. Sparks flew, and the console lit up with a weak, flickering glow. The bugs pressed harder, their numbers overwhelming. Cade and Jansen fell back to a barricade of derelict equipment, firing in controlled bursts to keep the swarm at bay. But as the bugs advanced, the static in their comms spiked, jamming their equipment and scrambling their targeting systems. "They're messing with our gear again," Jansen shouted, slamming his rifle against a crate in frustration. "Then we adapt," Cade snarled. "Cover me." Jansen gritted his teeth and resumed firing, his shots growing less precise as his injuries slowed him. Cade grabbed a satchel of explosives from his pack and dashed toward one of the main tunnels. He set the charges against the walls, his movements quick and practiced, despite the chaos around him. "Fire in the hole!" Cade shouted as he hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the chamber, collapsing the tunnel in a cloud of dust and debris. The bugs reeled, their coordination faltering as part of the swarm was cut off. "Elevators live!" Martel shouted triumphantly, flipping a switch on the control panel. The hum of electricity and machinery came to life around them as the elevator's system came online. The cage jolted into motion and began to descend from the surface with a groan of protest. "It's moving," she cried. "We're getting out of here." They could hear the sound of a dropship approaching. But before they could celebrate, the air shifted. A deep, resonant whistle cut through the chamber, louder and more oppressive than anything before it. From the shaft beneath the lowering elevator, a bug larger than the rest emerged, pulling itself up. Its shell gleamed darker and glossier than its kin, its triangular head crowned with jagged spines that pulsed faintly with blue light. Smaller bugs swarmed around it, moving in perfect synchronization as it surveyed the chamber. "What is that?" Jansen gasped. "A leader?" Martel wondered aloud, her voice trembling. The leader whistler raised a limb, and a pulse of energy surged through the air. The dropship above the chamber shuddered violently, its approach faltering as the leader's bioelectricity disrupted its systems. Cade grabbed Jansen, pulling him to his feet. "We take it down, now! It's blocking our extraction." The two soldiers advanced together, firing grenades that exploded in fiery bursts against the leader's shell. It stumbled away from the elevator shaft, but retaliated with a burst of energy that sent arcs of electricity crackling across the floor. Martel ducked behind the control panel, shielding her face as sparks rained down. Cade and Jansen pressed on, dodging and weaving through the leader's attacks. A smaller bug lunged at Jansen, slashing at his injured arm, but he swung his rifle like a club, smashing it aside. "Not today!" he roared, emptying the magazine into its ruined head. Cade threw his last grenade once the big bug was far enough from the elevator, the explosion ripping through the scout leader's flank. It staggered, its glowing blood spilling in arcs that lit the chamber like ghostly fireworks. The creature let out a keening, high-pitched whistle, its body convulsing violently as its internal power overloaded. Bolts of lightning burned scorch marks into the surrounding debris. But it still wasn't dead, just incapacitated. After a few seconds, the limbs twitched. "I really hate these things," Jansen said, lobbing a grenade that landed perfectly within the cracked shell of the hulking creature. Seconds later, it detonated, showering the area in phosphorescence. With that, the remaining bugs paused, whistling. Then, in unison, they retreated into the remaining tunnels. Martel hit the up button on the elevator, and the cage screeched open reluctantly, and she and the others got on. The cage groaned upward, carrying the now battered team toward the surface. Above, the dropship's system stabilized and came in for a landing, escort drones buzzing around it. "We made it," Martel whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the rising platform. Cade leaned against the cage, bloodied but victorious. "This isn't over," he said grimly. "That was just a scout. The real fight's still coming." Jansen smirked through the pain. "Good. Let him come." The dropship descended into the clearing with a roar, its engines kicking up plumes of dust. The faint light of dawn crept over the ruined city, but the battle-worn team had little time to admire it as they rushed toward the ship. The ramp lowered, and Cade hoisted Jansen over his shoulder, the younger soldier groaning with each step. "Easy," Jansen muttered through clenched teeth. "I'm not dead yet." "Not for lack of trying," Cade replied, his voice gruff but edged with the faintest trace of relief. He set Jansen down carefully on the ramp, motioning to the medics who rushed to stabilize him. "Get him patched up," Cade ordered before turning back. "Martel," Cade barked, "we can't wait." "Just a moment," she responded, checking the seal on a vial of the bioelectric fluid. She stood and sprinted to the ship, clutching her samples like precious jewels. As she stepped aboard, she gave Cade a triumphant smile. This could change everything. The ramp hissed shut and the dropship lifted, the city shrinking below them. Inside, the team sat in silence, their breaths heavy, their bodies battered. Jansen leaned against the bulkhead, his injured arm bound tightly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "We got out," he muttered, almost disbelieving. "Didn't think we would." "Barely," Cade replied, his voice low. He glanced at Martel, who was already logging and doing a preliminary examination of the fresh samples. They weren't only defending that nest, they were coordinating, targeting us like they knew how we'd react. "That scout wasn't just leading," Martel added, not looking up. "It was probing, testing us, their systems, their behavior. It's deliberate. They're not just scavengers. They're preparing for something." The comms crackled faintly, the static followed by the haunting whistle of the bugs. It was faint, distant, but it sent a chill through the cabin. At a secure laboratory deep within the city's fortified zones, Martel leaned over her workbench, her eyes scanning the microscopic details of the bug samples. The fresh biofluids glowed faintly in the containment vials, their energy pulsing in rhythmic waves. "Just as I thought," she murmured, more to herself than the others observing her. "Their entire physiology revolves around bioelectricity. It's not just a weapon, it's how they communicate, coordinate, adapt. It's infrastructure." She straightened, turning to Cade, who stood nearby, arms crossed. "They're jamming our signals and dismantling our tech because they're clearing the field. They're disabling us for something bigger." Cade's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Invasion? Well, a bigger invasion anyway, there are already so many." "Or something worse," Martel replied. "Whatever it is, they're not stopping until we're out of their way." Outside the lab's reinforced windows, the orbital elevator rose high into the stormy sky, its shadow stretching over the ruins below. The team's hard-earned victory felt small in its presence, a brief reprieve in what was clearly a much larger war, Operation Clean Sweep. The makeshift outpost on the edge of the ruins buzzed with activity, but the atmosphere was far from ordinary. A heavy tension hung in the air, punctuated by the low hum of distant machinery and the occasional crackle of static over the comms. The sun cast a long shadow from the spine over the encampment, its shadow stretching over the desolate landscape like an omen. Somewhere out there, the whistlers lurked, unseen but ever-present. In a dimly lit briefing room, Cade stood alone at the edge of a tactical holomap, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The map projected the targeted area, a grid of derelict industrial buildings, wide-open spaces, and civilian zones perilously close to the bug-infested ruins. His eyes traced the lines of the plan, searching for weaknesses. "Operation Clean Sweep. A bit on the nose, isn't it? Do you really think we can take them all out?" said Dr. Martel, stepping into the room. Her voice was mostly calm, but a slight tremor betrayed her underlying nerves. She placed a small device on the table, a rough, makeshift contraption that pulsed faintly with a greenish glow. The central component was no bigger than a thermos, but was easily the most valuable piece of equipment Cade had ever seen. "I'm not sure," he replied. We have a good setup, but supplies are a bit light, but that's always a struggle. Martel, dressed in a practical uniform instead of her usual lab coat, met Cade's gaze. I just finished the testing and it looks like this thing should work. It's designed to mimic the Whistler's bioelectric signals. It should lure them out so we can kill everything in that specific area. But, she hesitated, there's a risk. Let me guess, Cade said, his tone edged with skepticism. The signal might draw some from other areas? Martel nodded. We tried to calculate how many bugs we think are in the specific area, but we obviously can't know for sure. The beacon's range is amplified by the alien biofluids we incorporated. It's untested in the field, but it's the only way to lure them out before they reach the civilian zone. Cade's jaw tightened, his mind calculating probabilities. And if it doesn't work? We're bored, Donovan said, entering the room and leaning casually against the wall. His laid-back demeanor was in stark contrast to the somber mood of the conversation, but his sharp eyes betrayed his attentiveness. Even if it does work, we'll still need to move fast. Bugs don't play by our rules. Cade shot him a look. We've all fought Whistlers before, we know. Yeah, but without Jansen's help? Cade scowled. Jansen was one of their best, but he was still recovering. I'm just saying, Donovan said, mobility is key. We stick too close to that fancy gadget and they'll surround us before we know what hit us. Let my squad keep things loose. And waste ammunition while leaving the beacon exposed? Cade countered. We need to hold our ground, protect the device, thin their numbers where they're strongest. That's one way to do it, Donovan said with a shrug. But when has a Whistler fight ever gone the way we planned? Martel stepped in, her tone firm. This isn't about who's right. The beacon is our priority. We're no closer to understanding them than we were before. It's just a test, sure, but of everything we've learned so far. Cade nodded reluctantly, turning his focus back to the map. Fine, but we do this my way. Defensive positions, choke points, conserve firepower. Sure thing. Donovan pushed off the wall and tipped an imaginary hat. But don't say I didn't warn you when things get messy. Martel cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the table. The mission isn't just about defense or offense, it's about survival. And if the beacon works, if we can pull this off, it might be the first step to turning the tide against them. Cade straightened, his voice low but resolute. Then let's make sure we don't lose that step. The three exited the briefing room, stepping into the dim corridors of the base. Outside, the whine of dropship engines pierced the air, coming in for a supply drop. The mission was clear, but the weight of the unknown pressed on all of them. Somewhere in the ruins, the Whistlers waited, their eerie sounds a haunting promise of the fight ahead. The ruins of the industrial complex stretched out in jagged silhouettes against the gray horizon. Rusted beams jutted skyward like skeletal remains, and the air carried the scent of decay. The sound of boots on rubble echoed as the two squads moved into position, their movements purposeful but subdued. There wasn't enough ammunition for a drawn-out battle, and everyone knew it. Supplies of all kinds were very limited. Cade directed his team with precision, placing soldiers behind hastily constructed barricades made from debris and broken machinery. Keep the sightlines clear, he ordered, his voice clipped. Anything gets through, we're in trouble. Across the zone, Donovan's squad worked the perimeter. Their approach was looser, more flexible, as they scouted the edges for hidden threats. Donovan himself leaned casually against a half-collapsed wall, scanning the ruins with a practiced eye. All quiet for now, he muttered to his second-in-command. In the center of the zone, Dr. Martel knelt by the beacon. The device looked out of place among the rubble, a rough assembly of scavenged parts and alien biofluids encased in a reinforced housing. Its faint glow cast shifting shadows on her face as she worked. She connected the beacon to a power supply, her movements quick but deliberate. "How's it coming?" Cade asked, approaching her position. Martel didn't look up. "Almost there. The amplifiers need to sync with the power draw." She glanced at him briefly, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Once it's active, we'll have a short window to see if it works. The signal doesn't stay consistent for very long, and if it doesn't work right away, then, like Donovan said before, it'll be a very quiet day. The beacon powered up with a faint hum that deepened into a resonating low-frequency pulse. The greenish glow intensified, spilling across the rubble-strewn ground. Static crackled through the soldiers' comms, cutting off mid-transmission. "Comms are going out," one of Cade's men reported. "Stick to hand signals," Cade ordered, his voice rising over the hum. "Stay sharp." Martel adjusted the device, her fingers hovering over controls. The biofluids amplified the signal's range beyond what we would normally expect from this amount of power. The disruption is a side effect. It means the beacon is working. Around them, the air seemed to shift. The oppressive silence of the ruins was broken by an eerie whistling that floated through the debris, faint at first but growing louder. Cade raised his rifle, scanning the shadows. His soldiers followed suit, their grips tightening on their weapons. The first whistler appeared, emerging cautiously from a collapsed tunnel. Its glossy beetle-like shell reflected the beacon's glow, and its scalpel-like limbs scraped against the rubble. Another followed, then another, their triangular heads tilting, as if analyzing the strange signal. "Open fire," Cade commanded. The soldiers dispatched the first wave with quick, controlled bursts. The creatures fell, legs shattered, their bioluminescent blood pooling on the ground. That would only slow them, however, and they had to stay on alert as the whistlers slowly dragged themselves across the field. For a moment, the beacon's hum was the only sound. "Well," Donovan said from the perimeter, his voice faint due to the distance. "Looks like your gizmo works, Doc." Martel didn't reply. Her attention was fixed on the datapad in her hand, monitoring readings from the beacon. "They're behaving differently," she muttered. "These readings are way off." The whistling grew louder. More whistlers emerged, their movements faster, more aggressive. They didn't approach in a straight line, but spread out, probing the defenses. One scaled a wall, only to be shot down before it could leap. Another darted toward the beacon, its movements erratic. "Hold your fire until they're closer," Cade ordered. "We can't afford to waste ammo." The soldiers adjusted, aiming more carefully. Donovan's team shifted positions, picking off bugs trying to flank the perimeter. "They're testing us," Donovan said, his voice grim. "Smart." Martel crouched lower behind the beacon, her eyes fixed on the readings. "Yeah, it isn't random for sure," she said. "They're reacting to the signal, but it's not like last time. She hesitated, as if reluctant to voice her thoughts. "It's a very different signal now." Cade didn't reply, his focus on the advancing swarm. The ammunition count was dropping too quickly, and according to the sensors, they hadn't even hit the main wave yet. A soldier tossed a grenade, the explosion sending a cluster of bugs flying. The brief reprieve was welcome, but explosives were hard to come by. Martel glanced up sharply. "Can we keep this up?" she asked. "If we burn through our resources now." "We won't make it to later, Doc," Donovan interrupted, firing another shot. "We've got what we've got. We just need to be careful." The beacon's glow flickered momentarily, and the whistlers hesitated before surging forward again. Martel's datapad buzzed with alerts, her expression tightening. "There's something wrong. The signal, it's stronger than we anticipated. More are coming." "How many more?" Cade asked, his voice tense. Martel didn't answer immediately. When she looked up, her face was pale. "Too many." The whistling swelled into a cacophony, echoing through the ruins. From every direction, shadows moved, closing in. Cade's grip on his rifle tightened as he shouted to his team, "Hold the line! They're coming!" The whistling rose to a deafening crescendo, the alien symphony echoing off the skeletal remains of the industrial complex. Cade felt the weight of it vibrating in his chest, an oppressive pressure that sent shivers down his spine. The ruins around them seemed alive, the shadows shifting with the movement of countless legs and scalpel-like limbs. "They're everywhere," Cade said, his voice steady despite the cold dread clawing at his gut. He raised his rifle, scanning the flickering light of the beacon. "Hold your positions. Make every shot count." The next wave came like a ripple, a dozen glossy black forms skittering out of the darkness. Their triangular heads tilted in unison as if assessing the defenses. Then they surged forward, a coordinated blur of lethal precision. The soldiers opened fire, the crack of rifles blending with the low hum of the beacon. Whistlers fell, their glowing blood spraying across the rubble, but more came, undeterred. From the perimeter, Donovan's voice crackled over the patchy comms. "We've got movement on the north side, fast movers. They're flanking." Kay turned, cursing under his breath. "Shift fire to the north. Donovan, hold them off as long as you can." Donovan's squad darted through the rubble, using hit-and-run tactics to slow the advancing swarm. Grenades exploded in flashes of light, momentarily halting the whistlers but doing little to thin their numbers. "These things are smarter than last time," Donovan muttered, snapping off a shot that dropped a bug mid-leap. "They know what we can do now." The bugs didn't just charge blindly, even though they came in large numbers. They probed the defenses, testing weak points. One scaled a metal barricade, its limbs clicking as it dismantled the structure with horrifying precision. "Martel!" Cade shouted, firing at the bug. "They're getting too close to the beacon. We need to turn that thing off." "I know," Martel yelled back, frantically trying to manage the beacon's output. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she feverishly used the controls. The soldiers adjusted their tactics, shifting fire to cover the beacon. The bugs responded in kind, their movements growing faster and more coordinated. They scaled walls, burned out cars and barricades, attacking from above and below, forcing the soldiers to adapt on the fly. "They're dismantling us," one soldier shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Hold position," Cade barked. "We're not done yet." Cade hesitated, his gaze sweeping the battlefield. The barricades were crumbling, the soldiers stretched thin. Ammunition was running low, and the swarm showed no signs of slowing. "Do it already," he said finally, his voice tight. "Shut it down." None of the adjustments had worked. Martel pulled the power cable, but the glow stayed steady. Her eyes widened in fear. "It's powering itself now. I didn't think it would have that much power left. Nothing in the tests showed it could." For a moment, the bugs hesitated. The whistling softened, and Cade dared to hope they'd stop. The silence was shattered as the swarm surged forward with renewed fury. The whistlers didn't retreat. Instead, their movements grew even more erratic and aggressive, as if enraged by the change of power to the unit. They attacked indiscriminately, their scalpel-like limbs slicing through anything in their path. "What the?" Donovan shouted, firing at a bug that lunged toward his position. "How is this still happening?" The soldiers fell back, regrouping around the remnants of their defenses. Cade's voice cut through the chaos. "Focus fire! Protect Martel and the wounded! Fall back to my location and evacuate!" Donovan's squad moved to cover the flanks, their hit-and-run tactics replaced by a desperate attempt to hold the line. "We're out of grenades," one of Donovan's men called out. "Then use what you've got left," Donovan replied, his tone grim. The swarm pressed closer, their whistles reverberating like a relentless, mocking chorus. Cade aimed carefully, picking off one bug after another, but it felt like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. Around him, soldiers shouted commands, their voices tinged with exhaustion and fear. Everywhere, the partial remains of whistlers crawled toward them on broken limbs. The realization hit Cade like a punch to the gut. The beacon hadn't worked as intended. Instead of controlling the bugs, it had unleashed chaos. He fired another burst, his mind racing. "We can't hold this position," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Martel looked up, her face pale. "What do we do?" Kay's jaw tightened. "We fall back to the ship. Donovan, get your squad ready to cover the retreat." "On it," Donovan replied, his voice grim but steady. As the swarm closed in, Cade gave the order. "Fall back, now!" The soldiers moved quickly, dragging the wounded and covering each other as they retreated into the shadows of the ruins. Behind them, the whistlers swarmed over the remnants of their defenses, their eerie sound echoing into the night. The mission was on the verge of failure, and the nightmare was just beginning. The battlefield dissolved into chaos as the whistlers pressed their advantage. The bugs' movements became erratic, their attacks striking at random. They no longer probed the defenses, they swarmed with reckless ferocity, flooding through gaps in the barricades and scaling walls like a tide of razor-edged shadows. Cade's enhanced senses inside his power armor picked up every detail, the hiss of bioluminescent blood sizzling on metal, the sharp staccato of rifle fire, and the shrill whistles of the swarm, growing ever closer. His HUD flickered as static from the bug's bioelectric interference disrupted targeting systems. "They're everywhere," a soldier shouted. "Keep it together," Cade ordered, his voice amplified through his armor's external speakers. He fired in controlled bursts, each shot precise and lethal. A bug lunged for him, its scalpel-like limbs flashing. Cade sidestepped with an agility that belied his armored bulk, bringing his rifle up and blowing the creature apart mid-air. The whistlers attacked from all directions, their movements a nightmare of unpredictable speed and precision. One scaled a wall and dropped onto a soldier, its claws questing under the bottom lip of his helmet before plunging in. Another darted under a partial barricade, slicing at the vulnerable knee joints of fleeing soldiers. Cade's HUD lit up with damage reports from across the squad. "Fall back to this location," he ordered, marking a spot on the squad's HUD map. Donovan's squad was a blur of motion on the perimeter, their power armor amplifying their speed and strength. Donovan leapt onto a low rooftop, his enhanced leg servos propelling him effortlessly. From his vantage point, he sprayed suppressing fire, his targeting systems compensating for the bug's erratic movements. "We're thinning them out," he called over the comms, "but not fast enough." "They don't need strategy anymore," Martell shouted from her position behind a rusted-out car. She frantically dismantled the beacon's housing, pulling out its glowing core. "They're running on pure aggression. Just let me get the data." Cade aimed at a bug charging toward Martell, its limbs raised to strike. He dropped it with 3 shots, the recoil absorbed by his armor's stabilizers. Martell stared at the beacon in frustration, then, heaving the beacon over her head, smashed it into the ground, spraying fluid everywhere. Something detonated nearby, sending a cluster of whistlers flying, their bioluminescent blood painting the walls. "That was my last one," a soldier yelled, his tone laced with desperation. Now both squads were out of grenades. Cade's mind raced. Ammunition counters on his HUD showed critical levels across the squad. "Conserve your rounds," he ordered. "Focus fire on the ones closest to the wounded." Donovan's voice crackled through the comms, distorted by interference. "We're out of toys too, gonna get real personal soon." Cade gritted his teeth, shifting his strategy. "Donovan, keep moving, draw them away from the center." "On it." Donovan leapt from his rooftop perch, landing with a thud that cracked the pavement. His squad followed, their enhanced strength allowing them to push through rubble and lead the whistlers on a chaotic chase. They fired in short bursts, targeting legs and joints to slow the bugs down. Meanwhile, Cade's squad formed a defensive ring around Martell. A whistler lunged at him, its limbs raised high. Cade pivoted, grabbing it mid-air with enhanced reflexes. The servos in his armor groaned as he crushed the creature, its glowing blood seeping between his metal-gloved fingers. He tossed the remains aside, already aiming at the next threat. "Done," Martell shouted, holding up the salvage data chip. "I've got it." Cade scanned the battlefield. The barricades were mostly gone, the air thick with smoke and static. The whistlers were swarming in greater numbers than ever, their relentless whistles clawing at his sanity. "Time to leave," he said, switching to the open channel. "We're falling back again. Donovan, you and your team cover our retreat." Cade motioned to his squad. "Move, protect the wounded and Martell." The soldiers fell back in tight formation, their power armor shielding the injured as they pushed through the ruins. Cade stayed near the rear, his rifle barking as he cut down any bug that got too close. The enhanced strength of their armor allowed them to shove debris aside, clearing a path for the team. Donovan and his squad held their ground, fighting like cornered animals. One of his soldiers grabbed a whistler by the leg, using his strength to slam it into another bug with bone-shattering force. Donovan fired into the swarm with unrelenting focus, his grin replaced by a grim determination. "Don't stop until they're clear," he shouted, his voice raw. The retreat was brutal. The whistlers pursued relentlessly, their whistles echoing through the ruins as if mocking the soldiers' efforts. Cade's squad reached the extraction point, where they hastily set up a defensive position. "Donovan, we're in position," Cade called through the comms. "Copy that." Donovan's voice was strained but steady. "On our way." Moments later, Donovan's team broke through the swarm, battered but alive. Cade and his squad provided covering fire, their remaining ammunition barely enough to hold the whistlers at bay. The calls grew fainter, but Cade knew it wasn't over. He turned to Martel, who clutched the data core like a lifeline. "Let's hope your data's worth it," he said, his voice heavy. Martel nodded, her expression grim. "It better be." The remains of the beacon lay abandoned, its faint, sputtering glow casting long, flickering shadows over the ruins. The soldiers didn't look back as they ran, their footfalls muffled by the oppressive weight of the whistler's relentless chorus. The sound followed them, an alien dirge that echoed through the crumbling industrial complex. "Move faster," Cade shouted, his voice amplified through his armor's external speakers. His squad pushed forward, hauling the wounded while keeping their rifles trained on the shadows that seemed to shift and crawl around them. Martel clutched the salvaged core of the beacon, her breaths ragged but determined. "They're still following us," she managed, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah, I noticed," Donovan called, as he fired at a whistler darting through the rubble. The creature fell, its bioluminescent blood glowing faintly in the darkness. "Keep your head down, Doc." The soldiers weaved through the ruins, their power armor amplifying their speed and strength. But the whistlers were just as fast. They surged through the debris with terrifying agility, their scalpel-like limbs scraping against stone and metal as they closed the distance. "They're gaining," a soldier shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Suppressing fire," Cade ordered. The squad halted briefly, their rifles lighting up the dark as they laid down a withering barrage. Whistlers fell, their bodies twitching as their gleaming blood soaked the ground. But for every one that dropped, two more seemed to take its place. The soldiers reached the edge of the industrial zone, the looming silhouette of an abandoned warehouse offering a momentary reprieve. Cade motioned toward the structure. "Inside! Now!" They poured into the building, the heavy clang of boots reverberating through the cavernous space. Donovan's squad brought up the rear, firing in short, controlled bursts to slow the advancing swarm. As soon as the last soldier was inside, they slammed the doors shut and barricaded them with whatever they could find. Metal beams, crates, and fallen debris. "Seal that gap," Cade barked, pointing to a shattered window. Two soldiers moved to cover it, their weapons at the ready. The whistles grew louder, more insistent. The bugs slammed against the barricades, their scalpel limbs slicing through gaps and crevices. A soldier let out a strangled cry as a whistler's clawed appendage darted through a hole, grazing his arm before being pulled back. "Keep them out," Cade yelled, his rifle aimed at the nearest breach. He fired, the report of his weapon echoing in the enclosed space. The bug fell, twitching. The soldiers formed a defensive perimeter, their movements precise despite the chaos. Cade and Donovan worked in unison, coordinating the defense. "Focus fire on the choke points," Cade commanded. "We can't let them spread out." "We extraction better get here soon," Donovan muttered, reloading. "We're running on fumes." The soldiers redoubled their efforts, their weapons barking as they repelled another wave of whistlers. The bugs' persistence was unnerving. Even as their numbers dwindled, they kept coming, their scalpel limbs and oily black shells gleaming in the dim light. Martel glanced at Cade, her face pale but resolute. "They're not retreating," she said, "even with their losses." The dropship's searchlights cut through the darkness, light lancing in through the broken windows, illuminating the floor of the warehouse. The sound of its engines was deafening as it landed just outside, lowering its ramp. Cade motioned to his squad. "Go! Get the wounded aboard first!" The soldiers moved quickly, hauling their injured comrades toward the ramp. Donovan and his squad held the barricades, firing until their rifles clicked empty. When the last injured person was aboard, Donovan turned to Cade. "That's everyone. Let's move." The two squads retreated up the ramp as the whistlers surged forward one last time. The dropship's guns roared to life, cutting down the advancing swarm in a hail of firepower. The ramp closed, sealing the soldiers inside as the craft ascended. Inside the cabin, the soldiers sat in tense silence, their breathing heavy. Martel clutched the salvaged core of the beacon, her knuckles white. Cade looked out the viewport at the darkened ruins below, his jaw set. "They're not stopping," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The whistles faded into the distance, but the haunting sound lingered in his mind. The dropship's engines hummed with a comforting, steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos left behind. Its interior was dimly lit, casting shadows across the bloodied and battered soldiers seated along the walls. The air was thick with exhaustion and the metallic tang of scorched armor and sweat. Cade stood near the ramp as it sealed shut, his rifle still clutched in his hands, though the immediate danger was gone. "Move," he ordered sharply, gesturing to two soldiers struggling to haul a wounded comrade toward the med bay. His voice, muffled by his helmet, carried an edge of urgency even now. "Get him stabilized." Donovan leaned against a bulkhead, one gauntlet pressed to his side where his armor was scored and dented. "Relax," he muttered, his usual levity dulled by fatigue. "We're in the air, bugs don't fly, yet." Cade shot him a glare but didn't respond. Instead he turned to Martel, who was crouched on the floor, clutching the salvaged beacon core like a precious relic. Her face was pale, streaked with grime, and her eyes were distant, as if replaying the horrors of the past hour. "Is it intact?" Cade asked, his voice low but insistent. Martel nodded absently. "It's functional, and the data—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "The data might tell us something new. At least I hope so." The dropship lurched slightly as it gained altitude, the whine of its engines changing pitch. Inside, the soldiers sat in silence. No one spoke of victory. There was none to speak of. The swarm hadn't been stopped. The field wasn't cleared. Most had simply survived, and even that felt tenuous. Cade removed his helmet, revealing a face etched with fatigue and faint scars that seemed deeper in the dim light. He glanced at Donovan, who had slumped into his seat and was staring at the ceiling. "We failed," Cade said finally, breaking the silence. Donovan didn't look at him. "We lived, mostly. That counts for something." They both glanced at the empty seats that had been filled before the mission. Cade nodded reluctantly. His gaze shifted to Martel, who was still cradling the beacon core. Her fingers traced its surface absently, her lips moving as if she were whispering to it, or to herself. The debriefing room at the outpost was sterile and cold, its harsh lights a stark contrast to the dim interior of the dropship. Cade stood stiffly before a panel of officers, Donovan to his right and Martel to his left. The silence between them carried the weight of failure. "The operation didn't achieve its objective," Cade said bluntly. His voice was steady, but the frustration simmered just beneath the surface. "We couldn't hold the field. The beacon drew them in, but they adapted faster than we anticipated." "And when it was deactivated?" one officer prompted. "What happened then?" "They didn't stop," Cade continued. "If anything, they became more aggressive. It's like it made them angry. I've never seen them get angry before." Donovan shifted, his arms crossed. "They're not dumb animals," he added. "They're coordinated, tactical. If we keep treating them like pests, we're going to lose." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before turning to Martel. She placed the beacon core on the table, a series of lights on its side blinking. "The beacon worked," she began, her voice softer than usual, tinged with exhaustion. "It drew them in. But while the mission failed, it taught us something. These creatures aren't just reacting to signals, they're processing them, retaining them, changing them. We know they're intelligent, how they learn so quickly and work together. But how do we disrupt that?" one officer asked. Martel hesitated, then nodded. "Not in the way we understand intelligence. Their bioelectric systems are advanced, far beyond what we initially thought. The effects of the signal lingered after it was deactivated, like it had a mind of its own. Maybe they don't need their bodies to act and think like we do. We have structures to move and live in. Maybe what they really are is that liquid, and that's why all their separate parts can move independently. Like when you cut some types of worms into pieces, each piece can become a new worm. Maybe they are a fluid they pour into a new vessel. It's why they don't seem to care if they get cut to bits. It's not really a problem for them." The room fell silent, the implications sinking in. "What does this mean for future operations?" another officer asked, breaking the quiet. Martel leaned forward, her expression grim. "It means they're learning from us faster than we're learning from them. They're adapting faster than we can strategize. The beacon was a tool, but it might have also been a signal to them that we're escalating this fight." Donovan's voice cut through the tension. "Then we'd better escalate smarter. Next time we bring firepower. If we could just get our hands on it, that is." Cade remained silent, his mind replaying the chaotic retreat, the way the whistlers never stopped coming, their usual patience mostly abandoned. He could still hear their whistles in his head, a relentless alien dirge that refused to fade. Martel glanced at him, then at the beacon's data core, its lights blinking. "We need to examine this data and all of the combat footage. See if we can't make some kind of connection. We might not get many more chances." The bad drop. Jansen's first sensation was pain, sharp and unrelenting, radiating through his left side. His head swam as his eyes flickered open, the HUD of his helmet sputtering to life in fractured bursts. System diagnostics scrolled erratically, their glowing text barely visible against the cracked visor. The air smelled of smoke and scorched metal, mingling with the acrid tang of blood. He tried to move, but felt the weight of his power armor pinning him down. The dropship, the ambush, the mission. His memories came in fragments. His squad had been tasked with destroying a drone control center, a vital hub controlling waves of mostly autonomous combatants, wreaking havoc on their forces. Then the drop had gone wrong. Anti-air fire had torn through the sky, and he remembered the stomach-lurching sensation of falling before darkness claimed him. He managed to pull himself upright, his armor groaning in protest. Warnings flashed across his HUD. Left arm unresponsive. It also looked like there was a parasitic short draining his battery. He'd have to fix that soon or his armor would be dead weight. His rifle was still strapped to his back, though, and looked to be battered but functional. In the meantime, he powered up his armor, feeling his movements become easier under the heft of his equipment. Through the haze of smoke, Jansen spotted movement. A patrol of human combatants, their silhouettes sharp against the broken skyline. Instinctively he crouched low, his armor's servos whining softly. The patrol moved with purpose but seemed on edge, in a hurry, their weapons sweeping the ruins. Jansen held his breath as they passed, his mind already calculating his next move. If they'd been more thorough, they could have found him easily. He was alone, disoriented, and his squad was gone. But the mission wasn't over. The city was a graveyard, its skyscrapers hollowed out by the many cycles of war these last few years. Jansen moved cautiously, his boots crunching over shattered glass and loose rubble. The occasional burst of distant gunfire echoed through the empty streets. None of it sounded like something from his squad. Lower caliber weapons the locals had. By nightfall his body screamed for rest, but the patrols had forced him to keep moving. There were a number of them, both drones and humans. That made going very slow. He scavenged ration packs from an abandoned outpost, international relief supplies intended to help the civilian population but taken by the combatants. Even though he was able to rest a bit, exhaustion gnawed at him. On the second day, he found the remains of a battle, the distinctive casings of his squad's ammunition bright against the dust and debris. Holes in an abandoned car consistent with a high-caliber sniper rifle. Jansen scanned his surroundings. There, the perfect place for a sniper. It was a high-rise apartment building that would provide lots of places to hide and a clear view of the whole block. Entering through the shattered front doors, he found the stairs and ascended about halfway up the building before he started checking for snipers' nests. This section of the building had been hit a while ago by some sort of explosion. The floors above had collapsed, creating a makeshift ceiling that shielded him from drones patrolling overhead. It was here, as he searched for anything useful, that he stumbled upon the remains of Rick. At least of Rick's armor. Jansen's stomach churned as he realized Rick's power armor had been neatly dismantled, its components stacked beside an array of bones. The cuts on everything were impossibly clean, the kind no human could replicate, machined straight lines. Jansen dropped to his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Rick," he whispered. His HUD broke his reverie with an alert. Required components found. As it was scanning Rick's disassembled armor, a diagram appeared showing a suitable replacement for his damaged left arm power cable. He picked up the part and placed it in a pouch for later. Next to the remains, he found Rick's rifle, only partially disassembled. He took it and the parts, hoping he'd get the opportunity to repair it when he got a spare moment. He slung it over his shoulder, his jaw set in grim determination. Whatever had done this had stopped mid-project. They could be out there. He'd heard of gangs that employed slow and painful techniques to sow fear and secure their territory. He found a quiet corner and sat, making the necessary repairs to his armor and reassembling the rifle. He thought of the things he and Rick used to do together. Fishing in bomb craters from the war when they were maybe 6 years old. His nerves were on edge the whole time, and he watched and listened for enemies. None came, though, and he headed out soon after. Jansen's journey had become a lonely march through desolation. His HUD provided a rough map of the city, guiding him toward the possible location of the drone control center, but each step was a battle against fatigue and fear. He was doing better after the repairs, but his armor was still damaged, and his waning energy reserve forced him to conserve power, slowing his advance. The signs of an unknown enemy were everywhere. Severed cables dangled from walls, their cuts clean and perfect. Pools of faintly glowing liquid dotted the streets, their strange luminescence casting an eerie light in the darkness. Jansen avoided them, his instincts warning him to stay clear. On the third day he encountered his first hostile, what looked to be a single human guard stationed at a makeshift barricade. He was fiddling with a primitive drone. That could mean the drone control center was close. Jansen crouched behind a burnt-out vehicle, assessing his options. His power armor's targeting systems were unreliable, forcing him to rely on manual aim. He took the guard out quickly and quietly, using the shadows to his advantage. With deadly precision and a high-pitched whistle from Rick's gun, the shot found its mark. The man's body jerked violently, then fell behind a barricade, sending up a plume of gray dust. Jansen moved on without looking back. As he continued to approach the control center, he noticed more guards. These ones were acting strange, though. The guards weren't just defending their position, they seemed nervous, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting something to strike. Jansen couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones out here. Maybe it was others from his squad, but perhaps these people had encountered the dissectors as well. These guys were distracted and easy to avoid. By the time he reached the edge of the control center's perimeter, the sky was dark and the air smelled heavily of smoke. A series of explosions lit up the distance, their shock waves rattling the ground beneath his feet. His HUD crackled to life, picking up faint comms signals. For the first time in days, he knew he wasn't alone. The explosions rolled through the war-torn city like distant thunder, their shock waves rippling across the ruins. Jansen pushed himself forward, his boots crunching over shattered glass and twisted metal. His HUD blinked erratically, struggling to process the faint signal of a distress beacon. The identifier pinged. Cade. Alive, but barely. He quickened his pace, changing direction slightly toward the beacon, muscles aching under the strain of his damaged armor. The beacon's signal guided him through debris-strewn streets choked with smoke and ash. Twisted rebar clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, while half-collapsed buildings loomed above, their interiors hollow and silent. The air smelled of scorched concrete and something acrid he couldn't place. His heart pounded as he rounded a corner and saw the aftermath of the ambush. Blackened craters, bodies strewn across the ground, and smoldering wreckage. Jansen found Cade there, buried beneath a pile of rubble. His once pristine power armor was mangled, its plating cracked and leaking hydraulic fluid. Blood seeped from the gaps, staining the ash-covered ground. His left arm was crushed, twisted at an unnatural angle. The sight stirred something deep inside Jansen. Dropping to his knees, he gritted his teeth and began pulling away the debris. His hands trembled as he heaved chunks of concrete and broken metal, every motion a battle against exhaustion. "Cade, can you hear me?" he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. Cade's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. His voice was little more than a rasp. "You're alive?" "Yeah," Jansen muttered, finally freeing his squad leader from the rubble. He gripped Cade's good arm and hauled him upright, supporting his weight. "But it's not over. What happened?" Cade grimaced, his face pale under the grime. "There are these things. The whistling. It never stops. The center's destroyed, but—" He swallowed hard, wincing as a wave of pain shot through him. "They're still here. Hunting." Jansen froze as a faint, scratching noise reached his ears. It was soft at first, like claws skittering over metal, but it grew steadily louder. He turned, his grip tightening on Rick's rifle. "What are they?" Cade shook his head. "Abominations. They're here now." "Yes," Cade murmured weakly. "They're trapped in the rubble, I think. You can blow them to pieces, but they don't stay still for long. Whistlers." The scratching gave way to a haunting whistle, the sound reverberating through the rubble and setting Jansen's nerves on edge. His HUD lit up with proximity alerts as the first whistler emerged, one that hadn't been crushed in the collapse, its glossy black shell glinting faintly in the dim light. Its knife-like limbs clicked rhythmically and its triangular head tilted toward them as if analyzing its prey. The whistle grew louder, more piercing, and Jansen felt an icy dread creep down his spine. What is that?" It had a pyramid-like head, three-sided and pointed, lined with eyes, 3 arms, 3 legs, and utterly alien. "Here," he said, reloading Cade's rifle and shoving it into his trembling hand. "We're not dying today." More whistlers emerged, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They flowed over the rubble like liquid shadows, using cover, moving with horrifying precision. Jansen fired first, the blast from Rick's rifle striking the nearest whistler and sending a spray of glowing bioluminescent fluid across the ground. The creature spasmed, collapsing in a flickering heap. Down but not dead. Cade joined in, his shot slower but just as deadly. The air filled with the sharp cracks of rifle fire and the eerie hum of the whistlers, but for every one they took down, more appeared, their glossy forms relentless and agile. "We have to move," Jansen shouted over the chaos. He threw a grenade into the swarm, the explosion scattering the creatures temporarily. More bioluminescent blood sprayed across the battlefield, painting the scene in eerie hues of green. Using the momentary reprieve, Jansen led Cade into the ruins, guiding him up a crumbling staircase in search of higher ground. He found a low building with a flat roof and entered. With the jamming down, they had a chance of being picked up soon. The narrow corridors funneled the whistlers, forcing them to attack in smaller numbers. Jansen set traps along their path. rigging grenades to debris, collapsing walls to slow their advance. Each explosion sent glowing fragments of the creatures splattering across the ruined interiors. But it wasn't enough. The whistling grew louder, more chaotic, until it was all Jansen could hear. His armor blared warnings of low ammunition, and Cade's shots became sporadic. They were running out of time as they reached the roof. The sound of engines cut through the cacophony. Jansen looked up to see a lifter drone descending through the smoke-filled air, its spotlight carving through the chaos. The drone unleashed a barrage of suppressive fire, scattering the whistlers and buying the soldiers a precious few seconds. A winch deployed, its harness swaying in the wind. "Go!" Jansen barked, pushing Cade toward the lifeline. He covered the rear, firing until the rifle was empty. Cade grasped the winch, and Jansen followed, gripping it tightly as the drone began its ascent into the belly of the large drone. The battlefield shrank below them, the glowing blood of the fallen whistlers casting an otherworldly light over the ruins. Jansen slumped against the harness, his breaths rasped. The lifter drone carried them above the ruined city, the fires below casting a dim glow across the landscape. Jansen's armor was battered, his body bruised, but he was alive. Cade coughed, breaking the silence. "This isn't over," he said, his voice grim. "I heard them all through the city. The whole sector is compromised. Maybe more." Jansen nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I know, he hadn't heard them. Maybe Cade had pulled them all to his location, leaving his part of the city clear. He looked at Rick's rifle, the weight of their mission settling on him. The control center was destroyed, but at what cost? Rick was gone, most of the squad was gone, and the whistlers weren't done. It was a long flight back to base. Lone Vanguard. The spine's outer sector loomed around Donovan like a decaying jungle of steel and concrete. Towers of rusted metal stretched into the haze-filled sky, their shadows long over crumbled roads and debris-strewn alleys. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of corroded pipes and stagnant water. Sparks flickered from malfunctioning industrial lamps, throwing erratic, dancing shadows across the derelict landscape. Donovan moved swiftly through the chaos, his power armor's servos humming softly with each step. The suit, custom-built for speed and flexibility, hugged his frame like a second skin. Unlike the bulkier models used by frontline troops, Donovan's armor was stripped down, trading heavy plating for agility. Its matte black finish allowed him to blend into the shadows, and its HUD fed him a constant stream of data, atmospheric readouts, terrain scans, and motion detection. The streets below were quiet. Usually, the outer sector buzzed with scavenger activity, gangs stripping metal, arguing over scraps, or taking potshots at the occasional drone patrol. But today, only the distant groans of the spine and the occasional clang of loose metal punctuated the silence. Donovan tightened his grip on his rifle, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Donovan preferred it this way, just him, the ruins, and his instincts. Drones were reliable for routine sweeps, but they were predictable, easy for scavengers to avoid or disable. That's why he broke the schedule, patrolling on foot, throwing off the rhythm of anyone watching. He muttered into his helmet mic, logging his thoughts for later review. Sector 7B dead quiet. Either they're hiding or everyone's packed up and moved. He hopped down from a crumbling walkway onto the cracked asphalt below, his boots hitting the ground with a muted thud. His HUD flagged several abandoned vehicles ahead, their frames stripped bare. Scavengers had been here recently, but their tracks were faint. He crouched by a patch of disturbed dirt, running his gauntleted fingers over the faint imprints. Despite his laid-back demeanor, Donovan was always calculating. His ability to read the terrain, predict patterns, and stay one step ahead made him an effective scout. The spine was his hunting ground, and he knew its ruins like the back of his hand. His internal log recorded every step. The corporation demanded it, though Donovan often saw it as a way to keep himself grounded. He paused at a rusted ventilation shaft, his HUD flagging a faint heat signature inside. It was weak, erratic, like a flickering candle. Another scavenger den, he guessed, making a note to log it later for a drone sweep. As he moved further into the sector, his HUD pinged softly, signaling something unusual, a faint anomaly. A flicker of motion far too quick and fluid to be human. His sensors flagged it as unknown. Donovan stopped in his tracks, scanning the direction of the blip. "That's different," he muttered. He thought it might be a bird. The anomaly had come from an abandoned factory ahead, its massive doors hanging crooked on rusting hinges. It was a labyrinth of towering machinery and shadowy catwalks, a perfect hiding place for scavengers. But something felt off. The tracks he'd been following stopped abruptly outside the entrance, as if the scavengers had either doubled back or vanished entirely, or learned to fly like that bird on his sensors. Donovan's grip on his rifle tightened. His HUD flickered with warnings of degraded signal strength, probably the thick steel walls interfering with the feed. He tapped his helmet, switching to thermal mode, but the interior was a cold void, offering no clear readings. A faint noise reached his ears. It wasn't the creak of metal or the hiss of steam he was used to. It was melodic, a whistle, distant and soft, carried on the still air. It sounded like panpipes, or someone blowing across the top of a mostly empty bottle. His stomach tightened as the sound grew slightly louder, faintly rhythmic. Donovan hesitated, his instincts warring with his training. Something was wrong, but curiosity and duty pushed him forward. His boots echoed softly on the factory floor as he stepped inside, his rifle raised, his sensors scanning every shadow. The whistling stopped, but the silence felt full instead of empty. Donovan whispered into his mic, "Sector 7B. Something's here. Not scavengers, investigating." The anomaly blip appeared again on his HUD, closer this time. It was stationary, waiting. Donovan advanced carefully, every step filled with tension, every shadow a potential threat. His pulse quickened, but his hand stayed steady. "Let's see what you are," he whispered, disappearing into the factory's labyrinthine depths. The abandoned warehouse loomed overhead, a skeletal relic of a lost industrial age. Donovan crept through the twisted metal frames of broken machinery, his HUD flickering with intermittent motion alerts. Faint traces of heat signatures ghosted across his visor, but vanished before he could pinpoint them. "Definitely not scavengers," he muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. The broken concrete crunched under his boots, the sound quickly swallowed by the cavernous structure. As he advanced deeper, his HUD highlighted anomalies. Precise, clean cuts through power conduits and metal beams. The edges gleamed unnaturally under the dim light filtering through the cracked ceiling. "Clean work," Donovan whispered, kneeling to inspect the cuts. "Too clean. Not gang tools." His system flagged them as unknown damage patterns. A faint melodic whistle echoed through the warehouse. Donovan froze, scanning the area with his rifle raised. At first he dismissed it as wind coursing through the rusted beams. But the sound grew louder, its rhythm deliberate, almost curious. "Not wind," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The motion alert blared in his helmet, and his HUD locked onto a shadow shifting across the far wall. A glossy, black shape slid into view. Donovan's breath hitched. The creature was unlike anything he'd ever seen, all angles and edges. It was hard to understand what he was seeing. "Unknown hostile," his HUD displayed, struggling to classify the thing. "Yeah, thanks," he said to himself. It darted toward him with inhuman speed, its limbs carving through the air. Donovan fired instinctively, the rifle's muzzle flash illuminating the darkened space. The bullets struck the creature, sending glowing bioluminescent fluids splattering across the walls. But it didn't slow. The monster twisted mid-lunge, its glossy shell deflecting the brunt of the shots, and darted to Donovan's left flank. "Fast!" Donovan growled, pivoting sharply, his power armor's servos whining under the strain. He fired again, some of the rounds sparking off the creature's shell. The creature lunged, its scalpel limbs slashing at his chest plate. Donovan staggered back, sparks flying as the blades raked against his armor. His HUD blared with proximity warnings. He struck the creature with the butt of his rifle, hitting the creature's head. It recoiled briefly, its black lidless eyes assessed him. Just as Donovan regained his footing, his sensors picked up new movement, multiple signatures, human-sized. "Great," he muttered. A group of scavengers stormed into the warehouse, their weapons raised. They froze at the sight of Donovan and the insectoid locked in combat. "What is that thing?" one of them shouted. "Must be a rogue corporate drone," another replied. Donovan ducked behind a rusted beam as the scavengers opened fire, their bullets ricocheting near him and the bug thing. The creature pivoted, its head tilting toward the new attackers. It moved. The thing leapt into the scavenger group, opening pinpoint wounds. Neck, chest. The others scattered, their shouts filling the air. "Hey, I thought you wanted to play," Donovan shouted over the din. He used the distraction to regroup, his breathing ragged as he reloaded his rifle. The warehouse had become a war zone. The bug darted between scavengers with surgical precision, slashing through armor and flesh alike, their crude weapons and makeshift armor no match for the sharp talons of the beast. "Idiots," Donovan muttered, firing a burst into the creature as it lunged toward another scavenger. The rounds struck its side, most deflected, but some cracked the shell, splattering more of the glowing fluid. Some of the remaining scavengers turned their weapons on him. "Corporate dog," one shouted, firing a salvage shotgun. Donovan ducked, the blast narrowly missing his helmet. "You've got bigger problems, genius," he barked, gesturing toward the thing. The scavengers weren't listening. They focused their fire on Donovan, forcing him to retreat deeper into the warehouse. But the creature continued its methodical dismantling of the scavenger group. One man tried to swing a metal pipe at the creature. The monster caught it mid-swing and neatly severed the man's hand with one blinding swift swipe. Donovan knew he couldn't take them all on. His armor had taken a beating, and he was at his best while moving. The surviving scavengers, wide-eyed and bleeding, scattered in panic. Donovan didn't stick around to see how things turned out. He bolted for the nearest exit, his muscles burning as he climbed over wreckage. Outside, Donovan paused to catch his breath, his armor flashing critical damage warnings. He could still hear the faint whistle, distant but haunting. Unknown, hostile. With no time to dwell, he moved further into the sector, away from the known danger, vowing to make it out alive. The battle had left its mark, but Donovan wasn't finished yet. Donovan sprinted through the ruins, his breathing harsh in the confines of his helmet. His power armor was a bit sluggish, the servos struggling against the strain of battle damage. His HUD was a cascade of warnings. Armor integrity critical. Behind him, the melodic whistle pierced the air, haunting and rhythmic, echoing like a predator's call through the broken labyrinth of the spine's outer sector. It was closer now, almost teasing, as if it knew its prey was weakening. He didn't think he'd lost the thing, but had hoped the scavengers would have lasted a bit longer. Donovan ducked into a narrow alley between two crumbling buildings, his boots crunching on loose debris. The alley was choked with rusted piping and shattered glass, the walls smeared with decades-old graffiti. He slammed his back against a wall, his rifle aimed down the long distance to the start of the alley, his finger tense on the trigger. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting between his HUD's proximity warnings and the darkened corridor ahead. The whistle stopped, and the warnings disappeared. Donovan didn't wait for the ambush. He pushed off the wall and bolted further down the alley, his armor's enhanced speed propelling him over a pile of rubble. Behind him, the whistle resumed, louder now, accompanied by the metallic clink of scalpel-like limbs striking the ground. "Faster," he growled to himself, his muscles burning as he pushed the damaged armor to its limits. The thing emerged from the shadows, glossy black form glinting faintly in the dim light. It moved with terrifying speed. Donovan fired blindly over his shoulder, the rifle's muzzle flash briefly illuminating the creature's frame. The rounds struck its carapace, spraying glowing fluid, but the creature didn't falter. Donovan burst into another derelict factory, the space a maze of rusted machinery and catwalks. His boots clanged against the metal floor as he weaved through the towering structures, his HUD struggling to keep pace with the chaos. He vaulted over a conveyor belt and slid behind a massive press, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The whistle echoed through the factory, bouncing off the steel walls. A shadow flickered across his visor. Donovan rolled to the side just as the creature's blade-like limbs slashed through the press, splitting it cleanly in two. He fired a burst at the creature, the round striking its head and sending it skittering back, but only for a moment. It lunged again, its movements fluid like a dancer. Donovan ducked under its swing, his rifle clanging against the metal floor. He grabbed a rusted pipe from the ground and swung it with all his strength, connecting with the creature's side. The impact sent it staggering to its knees, but the pipe was bent and useless. A spiderweb of cracks had opened up on the creature from the impact, green glowing liquid dripping on the ground. Donovan didn't have time to celebrate the small victory. Scooping up his rifle, he turned and ran, weaving through the labyrinth of machinery. The whistle grew erratic, almost frustrated as it followed. He reached a stairwell and descended 2 steps at a time, the creaking structure barely holding under his weight. At the top, he kicked a barrel down the stairs, the clattering noise momentarily distracting the creature. His HUD pinged another warning. Ammunition depleted. Fantastic. Why didn't you tell me that sooner? He muttered, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Donovan emerged onto a catwalk overlooking the factory floor. The wind from the sector's gaping holes howled through the space, tugging at his armor. Below, that thing stalked the shadows, its whistle now a grating screech. He spotted an exit across the room, the glow of faint daylight spilling through the cracks in the wall. Summoning the last of his strength, Donovan sprinted across the catwalk, the metal trembling beneath his feet. The monster leapt onto the catwalk behind him, its scalpel limbs digging into the steel. Donovan glanced back, his teeth clenched as the creature closed the distance. As he reached the exit, Donovan grabbed a fallen girder section and wrenched it free. The catwalk groaned under the strain. He hurled the girder at the insectoid, the impact destabilizing the structure. That part of the catwalk collapsed, sending the creature plummeting to the floor below. Donovan didn't wait to see if it survived. He dove through the exit, landing hard on the cracked pavement outside some 20 feet below. Donovan staggered to his feet, his armor flashing critical damage warnings. His lungs burned with every breath, and his vision swam from exhaustion. The whistle was gone, replaced by the distant groan of the spine. He leaned against a rusted wall, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Sector 7B, he muttered into his helmet mic. Hostile confirmed. Unknown classification. Send backup. Static greeted him. His comms were down. Donovan straightened, his resolve hardening. Fine. I'll do it myself. He moved toward the extraction point at top speed, every step a painful reminder of the battle he barely survived.